Okay, so answer format. Paper 2, section B, basically your 8 and 12 mark questions, the format for that. This is a slight, somewhat of a jugaad way to look at it. But the reason why I think answer to following a certain format is important in these questions is because a lot of people, in fact most people by this time at least, would have a good set of notes, and hopefully a lot of them have either understood the content or have memorized it, like whatever works. So you don't really get the grade based on how well you know economics. You get the grade based on if whether or not you know what to write uh, for a particular question and the way to structure your answer. Um, and this stuff has at least worked for me. So it's just anecdotal evidence, but uh, it I believe it works. So if you look at it, uh, so you have your part A, and I don't have a drawing pad, so this don't try going to try to type as much as possible rather than try to draw with my mouse. So, but if you really look at your part A, so the keywords the examiner normally is explain. These are recall questions. Ergo, there's not a lot of thinking you have to do in this. Is just if you know the concept and the theory well enough, if you know the content, you should be scoring well on this. Um, Again, this is going to be your 8 mark question. And the important thing here is the way you break these marks. So 8 marks, excuse the handwriting, the first 4 marks are going to be for your introduction, which basically is, definitions, formulas if relevant, like, the formula for PED, or if you're given, if it's a question on aggregate demand, you might want to list down the components, all of that type of stuff. So, etc. Here you go. So for the first 4 marks, you're not really going to answer the question, but you're going to try to build up to it a nice introduction, which should at least give the examiner, uh, communicate to the examiner at least that you have knowledge about at least what these economic terms that are relevant to the question, um, what they're about basically. So we're going to do a few examples as well just to clarify that, but just going through the format at the moment. So for the next 4 marks, that's where you actually explain and basically you answer the question. For example, if the question asked for factors affecting demand, you in the first 4 marks you will just basically going to be talking about what demand is, for example, how can you affect demand, what type of changes can come about in demand, extensions, shifts, etc., etc. All those definite, all the kachra is above, and in the next 4 marks you actually explain and answer the question, and that's basically the way you should be going about in your 8 mark question, and hopefully a lot of you know this by now. Let's go to part B though. Part B is normally a little trickier. So this is your 12 mark question. Here, there's normally some type of debate happening. Like in part A, this type of stuff is not normally, in fact, it's always a one-sided answer. So they're just going to ask you, um, sorry, yeah. So whatever they ask you, you just basically answer that. You don't really have to evaluate or discuss or criticize what you're really talking about. Whatever they've asked, you just go ahead. So if they've asked you to explain the factors affecting PED, you just go for it. If they've asked you to explain how a producer can use the concept of PED to increase total revenue, you just tell how the producer can. You don't necessarily evaluate or criticize or try to conclude whether the producer would ever be able to use PED, or just you don't have to give all of those limitations, etc., etc. Those are basically there in your 12-mark question. So the keywords, well, if just in case, the keywords the examiner normally uses are usually discuss. If not discuss, then evaluate. Again, this is supposed to be a 12, sorry, a two-sided answer. It's going to be a lot of some discussion, we're going to be talking about one side and then the other side, and then there's going to be a conclusion, and that's basically how we're going to break up these 12 marks. So it's a very poor arrow. Okay, my artistic skills aren't too good. Okay, that's an arrow, just take my word for it. So for example, normally in a question you'll have 4 marks for one side, you'll have 4 marks, again a very poor arrow, for the other side. So normally 4 marks for saying yes, whatever you said will happen, 4 marks for saying no, it won't happen, and then you have a conclusion for 4 marks. To give you guys an example, okay, so for example, and in fact we'll do this one as well, is discuss whether an economy would ever, or sorry, no, let's not do that one. Yeah, discuss whether an economy will always welcome deflation. So for 4 marks you'll be like, yeah, welcome deflation. For 4 marks you'll be like, no, it won't. And in the end you will basically conclude, and the conclusion is basically where a lot of people lose their marks. So this is slightly difficult, not as difficult as trying to write with a mouse, but yeah, this is, oh my god, that's bad handwriting. Yeah, just assume that I wrote difficult. So in part A, I mean, you can score full, to be honest. It's if you know if you know what the question's asking about, and you don't get excited, you don't forget the initial 4 marks. Because a lot of students do that, even if they know it. When they actually go and try to answer the question and go inside and like basically go for their paper, they get excited and they just move on to the next 4 marks, which are basically your explain marks. So part A, you can score full. In part B, if if you can write well and you do have knowledge, the first 8 marks aren't that difficult, like, to score. Like, the first 4 marks where you're either saying yes, and the next 4 marks where you're saying no, or basically we're just talking about one thing or the other. For example, there was a question, discuss whether cost push inflation is discuss whether changes in AD are more likely than changes in AS to cause inflation. So for 4 marks, you'd write how AD can cause inflation. For 4 marks, you'd write how AS can cause inflation. And then you would conclude. Right. So let's look at an example. Let's go with part A first. And this is a very common question. I use this as an example a lot because it did come in a lot of past papers, and really helps make the point I'm trying to make at the moment. So explain how a producer can use the concept of PED, price elasticity of demand, to maximize total revenue, or just to his benefit. So 8 marks for that. Yeah, so you can see it now. Okay, so again, look at the question, understand that we're not going, the question is asking how a producer can use the concept of PED to maximize total revenue. That's basically the question is about, what can the producer do? But we're not going to get to that right away. We're first going to dilly-dally and really start with some introductions, clarify a few things, and then we're going to get to it. So the first thing I think one should do is firstly clarify, the producer's motive, goal. In this, if you use the phrasing I've used, it's in this particular question, it gets a little easier. But normally, it's good to clarify how the producer is profit motivated, and one way to go about is to maximize total revenue, and hence he or she would implement a pricing strategy which allows him to do that. Just a one-line intro to get yourself started off. And then if you're a little confused, just at this time, just try to define and explain the economic terms present in the question. It's not the ideal way to go about, but if you're not too sure how you should start off, that is a safe way, safe, a safe option. So you have the PED's definition plus formula. Don't forget formulas. Formulas does do help. Just give it helps you get that one mark that they at times have for the formula. So you define what PED is. It's uh, you know is the measure of the responsiveness of the percentage change of quantity demanded to the percentage change of price. Some people use proportionate change. It really doesn't make a difference, and then you write the formula. Then you identify the two realistic cases. The reason I'm saying two realistic cases, because again, the question's about how a producer can use PED. So you would have to, limit your answer to the realistic cases, especially because of the time constraints. So realistic cases, you have two. One is where the formula generates a value of greater than one, which is one where the formula generates a value of less than one, and these greater than one again is going to be elastic. So you identify that this is the case and you define this as well. Less than one is inelastic, and you define this as well. The definitions are again very easy. Elastic is just where the proportionate change in quantity demanded is greater than the proportionate change in price. That's it, and just reverse that for inelastic. But what you've done here is you should get a mark for the definition and and the formula of PED, a mark or two there. For elastic and inelastic, identify that these are the two major cases in which the producer could basically face, and defining them should also give you a mark each. So basically, you should have secured 4 marks for this, a very successful introduction. Sorry. So note, I haven't really answered the question, where the question is basically talking about how a producer can maximize PED, what a producer can do. Haven't really even touched upon that as of yet. So the first 4 marks, just clarifying things, identifying, defining things. The next 4 marks in this particular question are very easy. You take the two cases. One is elastic. Okay, so you take your you basically just talk about the two cases. I'll just type it for the other one because I wish I had a drawing pad. That would make life so much easier. But so you take your elastic and your inelastic case, and you basically just talk about how the producer can use a pricing strategy, because that's really what the producer can mainly do. That's the easiest thing for him to do. And maximize total revenue in both cases. And you should get 2 marks for talking about each case. 1 mark for just identifying whether it should be a price increase or decrease, and also the second mark for explaining along with the following diagram. Okay, so in elastic, if the producer even slightly reduces his price, the QD, quantity demanded, should go up by a much larger proportion, because that's the definition of elastic. And since again, okay, it's a very bad star. Let me try again. Yeah. So total revenue, if you remember, and you can include this in your answer as well if you want to, no harm in the first 4 marks. Total revenue is price into quantity. So obviously, if your price goes down by a bit, but your quantity demanded increases by a much larger margin, your total revenue will maximize. And that's basically what the producer has, your total revenue will increase. And that's what the producer has to do. And you have to add a diagram here as well, just to be on the safe side and actually get all of those marks. In the elastic case, you have a flat demand curve. Just show two prices. One, if I draw with a different color maybe. So this could be one. Yeah, so this could be one set of price and quantity. And I swear my handwriting is not actually this bad. I mean, it's pretty bad, admittedly, but uh, it gets worse when you do stuff like this without a drawing pad. Okay, this is kind of off. But the idea, I think you guys get the idea. The idea is basically to show how a small decrease in price will just lead to a much larger increase in quantity. If you show that in the diagram, that's more than enough. And if you want, you can have a key identifying total revenue, which is basically just the area, the rectangular area, price into quantity, right? Very similar thing you do for inelastic. Inelastic, you can increase price by a large extent, because if you do so, quantity demanded will fall, definitely maintaining their inverse relationship, but it will fall by a much less extent because the response is less. It's an inelastic case, and hence your total revenue will also increase, because while one variable is falling, the other is increasing by such a large extent that your overall total revenue should increase. And you can draw a diagram here as well. If we take, this is price, quantity. It's a very simple question, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to communicate, which is not really the content itself, but rather what you uh, what is required from you in an 8 mark and what we'll get to in a 12-mark question. Here, just try to show two sets of price and quantity, how price is increasing, how such a large increase in price would still lead to, this is okay, this is a horrible arrow, but yeah, just a very small decrease in quantity. So there you have it. And if you do so, you should get 4 marks for this one as well. 2 marks for the elastic case, 2 marks for the inelastic case. And if you've explained it, by explanation, I just mean whatever I've written here in arrows, just kind of explain it normally. You don't even need to give too much of reasoning. And you draw two acceptable diagrams. And sorry, this shows not two. You should get 4 for this. Yeah, and you should get 4 marks. And this is shouldn't take you that long. I mean, you should definitely do it fast. You could probably write it all in less time than it took me to try to write with this mouse type pen. But yeah, so that's 8 marks for you. Just one thing I missed out, in fact. So your 8 and 12 marks, the time ratio that you should be allocating is kind of like, it should be 1 to 2. So if you have 45 minutes for your question, your section B, 15 minutes for 8 marks, and yeah, 30 minutes for 12 marks. If surprisingly you have an hour for section B, 20 minutes for 8 marks, 40 minutes for 12 marks. Because the idea here is that 8 marks, while 8 and 12 there's only 4 mark difference, but 8 marks you should be doing. It shouldn't take that much time. You just have to recall the concept and write it down. 12 marks can still get a little tricky. Um, so that was that. Because I have no clue how to shift the screen, I'll just clear it. Or I'll just clear this side of it. Ooh. And go away, bitches. I mean, I'm very technologically challenged. And it's also like 4 in the morning, so I have no clue what I'm doing with my life. Okay, we're good to go to look at a 12 marker. Yeah, and normally the 8 and 12 mark questions, they follow common theme, because after all, the it is one question. However, in this case, we'll just discuss what an example I gave before. discuss whether an economy would always welcome deflation. 12 marks. Now, understand, because in an actual exam, the entire question would probably be based upon inflation and deflation, right? So in part A, you probably would have defined in either inflation or deflation. So there's no real need to go into definitions and introductions. Technically speaking, you're not really. I mean, even if you don't give an introduction in part B, you should be good. It's still ideal to give one. Just makes your answer look. I mean, it just it makes your answer look better. But what's really important in part B, as we've seen here, is you have four marks. So solid side discussing that yes, this XYZ would happen, or yes, an economy would welcome deflation. 4 marks to the opposite. So you have some sort of debate going around, and you have a conclusion for 4 marks, and that is kind of tricky, and we'll spend a lot of time on that when we get there. Okay, so let's look at this. So you'll have 4 marks for saying that the economy, would welcome. You have 4 marks saying the economy wouldn't welcome. And basically, like, it's the pros and cons of deflation. So when you're basically, this is just your pros and cons. So if you have, okay, this is very bad handwriting, but if you have 4 marks like allocated to one side, realize that if you write 2 solid reasons, you should be good. 1 mark for identifying the reason, the other for developing on it. Obviously, to be on the safe side, and if you do have time and you write quickly and you can think of a third reason, why not? But 2 should be good enough. I'm not really going to go into the content here, but just understand 4 marks, just write about why inflation is beneficial to the economy. Examples could include purchasing power of money, how that increases. You could talk about competitiveness, or at least price competitiveness of exports. That's something that could be relevant. Stuff like that. So a lot of things you can write about. And again, that's what I want to emphasize on here, that a lot of economics, even if you don't, hopefully by your CIE exam you will, because you have good notes and it's not very difficult to just go through them. But the issue is you have to know what to write and where, and the way to structure your answer. That's really where people lose marks. That and the 4-mark conclusion. Okay, and wouldn't welcome, you can write about a lot of things in wouldn't welcome, to be honest. So, you have unemployment, for example, output, less output, and you can really develop output or national income, and you can develop a lot on this, right? You could link it to a lot of things, so that's fine. I mean, I don't think that's an issue. The main issue that comes about is your conclusion. So like here, basically, a good answer, properly well developed, would get 4 marks for this, 4 marks for this. 4 marks saying that yes, an economy would welcome deflation, 4 marks are saying it wouldn't. You don't necessarily have to rebut or criticize what you've written, over in one section. You don't have to necessarily engage with that or rebut it directly in the other. Just fulfill what's required. At times, there are questions where they're not necessarily, the 2 sides you're writing about aren't necessarily contradictory, but the question is just so. For example, discuss whether PED or YED, the concepts of PED or YED would be more useful discuss whether which of the concepts of PED or YED would be most useful to a producer. So for 4 marks, you write about PED, how that's useful to a producer. For 4 marks, you write about YED, how that's useful to a producer, and then you would conclude. So you don't necessarily have to um, criticize PED in the YED column or criticize YED in the PED column. In that particular question, the two sides are basically like two kind of separate, disjointed things. That's fine. You can talk about general limitations in the conclusion and so forth. And let's just get to the conclusion. So, a good conclusion, which is difficult to write, is something that really sums up the entire matter. Um, Something that makes all of the bakwas you've done in the above 8 marks seem irrelevant. Like, yeah, those are factors, but the most important factor is this. And normally conclusions are good, like really go have a taste of it depends. So, for example, there are two conclusions that are normally pretty easy to write when you're talking about debating with market or planned economies. You can normally conclude with saying how in this day and age, really, both economies have limitations, but those limitations can be significantly reduced in the mixed economic system. Same thing with your exchange rate system. You have two extreme ends of the spectrum. Your floating and fixed, and then you have managed float, which is something you can use in the conclusion. Here, another example, like normally when you have questions about trade, there was a question whether the where external factors would be more influential on deciding the rate of inflation than internal factors. And like you just need stuff that kind of wraps it up really well. So one point with regards to stuff like this about is how open the economy is. If it and that's how you get the it depends flavor in. If it is open, then maybe external factors would dominate. If it isn't as open, like if you're North Korea, then definitely internal factors. So if you can get an it depends tinge to your conclusion, you should normally, at least more often than not, be in the correct direction. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. So the conclusion we're going to write will also be on the lines of how it really depends. So it depends, and what does it depend on? The position of the economy. So what do I mean by that? I mean by by the condition or the situation of the economy. If the economy is already undergoing high inflationary pressures, then yeah, it would like some deflation, right? If the economy is experiencing a long drawn recession, then definitely not. It wouldn't want more deflationary pressures. So it really depends upon the situation, or rather the position of the economy. The reason I'm using the position is because I think you can draw a very nice business cycle, hopefully nicer than mine. You have time period here, you have uh, GDP or national income here. GDP, let's just write GDP, it's easier. And you have time period, yeah, and you have your business cycle. Very bad handwriting, I know, but yeah. So if you're somewhere here, let me just show that. Like if you're close to a boom, if you're anywhere here, if you're facing high inflationary pressures and inflation is just coming, then you you would probably welcome deflationary pressures, right? You would welcome deflation because that helps you get back to the median line. However, if you're already in a slump, then what you need is not deflation but inflation. Further deflation will only uh, increase the intensity of your slump, and all the issues that you've highlighted over here, they become far more potent. Unemployment is going to be at a much larger scale if the deflation that's occurring in the economy uh, is is after already existing deflation, is just adding on to already existing deflationary pressures. So that's that is something you can for this particular question write in the conclusion, because it gets at it depends case in. I haven't written a lot here, but the idea again, you'd explain this, you would explain how you'd write a bit about that, about if there are already inflationary pressures, if it's going near a boom, and you perhaps take a point on your business cycle, then you'd welcome. If not, if you're already in a long drawn recession, you probably wouldn't welcome, to put it very simplistically. And that's your conclusion, which should get you 4 marks. So don't be stingy with the conclusion. Don't write a 1 or 2 line conclusion and expect to get marks. You very rarely do you have to draw a diagram in the conclusion. It just so happened that I was fitting here, so I went ahead and drew one. But yeah, try your best to be as comprehensive in the conclusion as possible. Do not cut corners there, because that's where you're going to lose the maximum amount of marks. Just one more thing, I'll just quickly erase this, or I'll just clear it all. Yeah. So a few more things that I wanted to highlight, specifically since we're talking about paper, how to write answers and so on. So writing, I don't know what to call them. Let's just call them writing pointers. Just a few things that will help you ensure that the examiner doesn't really mess up with your paper. You can't really trust those people. So first thing is new point, new paragraph. So for example, you were talking about the factors that affect demand, and suppose you've decided to talk about 3 factors. You decided to talk about disposable income, the success of advertisements, and price of related goods. I want you to have a different paragraph, albeit a small one, for all of these 3 factors, because the examiner will really only skim. And what happens when you change your paragraph or indent or do something to grab his attention once you're starting a new point, helps ensure that the examiner doesn't go past it, doesn't miss it. Because otherwise it can be easy to do so, especially if it's just one big jumbled up khichdi. So like, even if you were talking about the price of related goods, again, have a different paragraph for complements, a different paragraph for substitutes, to ensure that there can be no mistakes there, that the examiner just will notice, because he does notice when you've changed a paragraph, right? And that helps bring attention to a new point that you were making. And again, the format that I've told you for 4 and 8 marks, definitely when you're talking about one side, different paragraph, you could have further many paragraphs just on that one side. For another, completely different few paragraphs, and etc. and so forth. I think you guys get the idea. The second thing is flag posting or sign posting. Okay, I just wrote flag post, not flag posting, my bad. But flag posting or sign posting, something we do in debates, something that for me at least is work in economics. The idea is that you tell the examiner what you're going to write before you even write it. So let's take the same example. Let's say you were going to talk about the factors that affect demand. You're about to start writing about those factors in 3 separate paragraphs, because you're going to cover 3 factors. But before you do, you just write a simple one-liner about how there are many factors that affect demand, and this answer will look at 3: disposable income, price of related goods, and the degree of success of advertisements. And hence, if the examiner reads that one line, he or she would know that these 3 factors are going to be elaborated upon, and hence I should look out for them. Again, this doesn't really work if you have no clue what you're going to write about and you're just writing and trying to make up stuff as you go along. But if you read the question and you know for sure what your answer is going to be, the answer just clicks to you, then this really, really, really does help in those particular cases. So new point, new paragraph, do flag post, or just call it signpost or signposting, whatever. Yeah, and that's pretty much it for this for these writing pointers. I really can't think of anything else. Again, unfortunately, economics has become more of who really manages to write an answer that would get like the exam can really tick off all the boxes in, rather than who really knows economics the most. So do familiarize yourself with the content, but definitely do try to focus on writing answers and past paper practice. That's it.